What if I told you that the world's fourth most populous country has a history so rich and complex that it makes Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story? We're talking about a land where Hindu kingdoms built temples that rival Egypt's pyramids, where spice traders became so wealthy they could buy entire European cities, and where a single volcanic eruption literally changed the course of world history. This is Indonesia, and its story will blow your mind. Most people think Indonesian history starts with Dutch colonization, but that's like saying American history begins with the Civil War. We're missing thousands of years of incredible civilizations, epic battles, and cultural achievements that shaped not just Southeast Asia, but the entire world. Today, we're diving deep into the untold history of Indonesia, from its ancient kingdoms to its emergence as a modern nation. And trust me, this journey is going to be absolutely wild. Let's start with something that will completely change how you see ancient history. Picture this. While Europe was still struggling through the Dark Ages, Indonesia was home to some of the most sophisticated maritime empires the world had ever seen. We're talking about the Srivijaya Empire, which controlled the crucial Strait of Malacca from the 7th to the 13th centuries. This wasn't just some small trading post. This was a massive naval superpower that made merchants from China, India, and the Arab world pay tribute just to pass through their waters. The Srivijaya Empire was like the Amazon of the ancient world. But instead of delivering packages, they were controlling the flow of gold, spices, silk, and precious stones across the entire Indian Ocean. Their capital, Palembang, was so wealthy and cosmopolitan that Chinese scholars described it as more magnificent than anything they had seen in their own empire. Imagine a city where Buddhist monks from Tibet debated philosophy with Hindu priests from India, while Arab merchants negotiated deals with Chinese traders, all under the protection of Malay naval forces. This was globalization, 1,000 years before we thought it existed. But here's where the story gets even more incredible. While Srivijaya dominated the seas, another empire was rising on the island of Java that would create one of the most spectacular architectural achievements in human history. The Majapahit Empire didn't just build cities, they built monuments. That would make modern architects weep with envy. We're talking about Borobudur, a Buddhist temple complex so massive and intricate that it took over 75 years to complete and used more than 2 million stone blocks. Think about this for a moment. In the 8th and 9th centuries, while most of Europe was dealing with Viking raids and feudal warfare, Indonesian architects and engineers were creating a structure so mathematically precise and symbolically complex that scholars are still discovering new meanings in its design today. Borobudur isn't just a temple. It's a three-dimensional representation of Buddhist cosmology, a stone mandala that guides pilgrims through the journey from earthly desires to enlightenment. The precision required to plan and execute such a project suggests a level of mathematical and engineering knowledge that rivals anything from the classical world. Now, here's where Indonesian history takes a dramatic turn that most textbooks completely gloss over. The arrival of Islam in Indonesia wasn't a violent conquest like in many other parts of the world. It was one of the most fascinating cultural transformations in human history. Instead of Arab armies showing up with swords, Islam spread through Indonesia via trade networks, Sufi mystics, and intermarriage between local rulers and Muslim merchants. This created something unique, a form of Islam that blended seamlessly with existing Javanese, Balinese, and other local traditions. You ended up with Muslim kingdoms that still incorporated Hindu-Buddhist court ceremonies, Islamic rulers who claimed descent from ancient Javanese kings, and mosques built in traditional Indonesian architectural styles. The Sultanate of Demak, established in the late 15th century, became the first major Islamic kingdom in Java, but it maintained many of the administrative and cultural practices of its Hindu-Buddhist predecessors. The genius of this cultural synthesis becomes clear when you look at the Wali Songo, the 9 Islamic saints who are credited with spreading Islam throughout Java. These weren't foreign missionaries imposing alien customs. They were brilliant cultural translators who used wayang puppet shows, gamelan music, and traditional Javanese poetry to communicate Islamic teachings. They turned conversion into an artistic and intellectual adventure rather than a cultural abandonment. But just when Indonesian civilization was hitting new heights of cultural sophistication, European colonialism arrived like a wrecking ball. The Portuguese showed up first in the early 16th century, followed by the Spanish, English, and finally the Dutch. What most people don't realize is that European colonization of Indonesia wasn't a quick conquest. It was a centuries-long process that faced fierce resistance from sophisticated local kingdoms. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, wasn't just a trading company, it was essentially a state within a state, with its own army, navy, and the authority to wage war and sign treaties. They didn't conquer Indonesia all at once. Instead, they spent over 300 years gradually expanding their control through a combination of military force, economic pressure, and political manipulation. They would play local rulers against each other, support one side in succession disputes, and gradually transform independent kingdoms into dependent client states. The story of Sultan Hasanuddin of Goa perfectly illustrates the tragedy of this period. Known as the Rooster of the East, Hasanuddin led a fierce resistance against Dutch expansion in eastern Indonesia during the 17th century. For decades, his kingdom successfully challenged Dutch naval supremacy and maintained independence through clever diplomacy and military innovation. But eventually, superior Dutch firepower and the gradual erosion of local alliances led to his defeat. His story represents the broader pattern of Indonesian resistance: brave, intelligent, but ultimately overwhelmed by European technological and organizational advantages. Here's something that will absolutely shock you about the scale of Dutch exploitation in Indonesia. The Dutch didn't just extract spices and precious metals. They fundamentally restructured Indonesian society to serve European economic interests. The infamous cultivation system, implemented in the 19th century, forced Javanese farmers to dedicate 1/5 of their land and labor to growing cash crops for export to Europe. This wasn't just taxation. This was systematic economic slavery that created famines and destroyed traditional agricultural practices that had sustained Indonesian communities for centuries. The human cost was staggering. Population estimates suggest that Java's population actually declined during certain periods of Dutch rule, despite the typical pattern of population growth during the 19th century. Entire regions were devastated by forced labor, crop failures, and diseases introduced through increased contact with European traders and administrators. The Dutch literally rewrote Indonesian economic and social structures to maximize profit extraction, turning one of the world's most prosperous regions into what economists now recognize as a classic case of colonial exploitation. But Indonesians never stopped fighting back, and their resistance movements were far more sophisticated and internationally connected than most people realize. The Java War of 1825-1830, led by Prince Diponegoro, wasn't just a local rebellion. It was a coordinated resistance movement that combined traditional Javanese military tactics with Islamic religious mobilization and proto-nationalist ideology. Diponegoro managed to tie down the Dutch colonial army for 5 years, inflicting casualties and economic costs that shocked the colonial administration. Even more impressive was the emergence of early Indonesian nationalist movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Organizations like Budi Utomo and Sarekat Islam weren't just protest groups, they were sophisticated political movements that combined Western organizational techniques with traditional Indonesian cultural symbols and Islamic religious networks. They created newspapers, established schools, organized boycotts, and built the intellectual and organizational foundation for eventual independence. The story of Indonesian independence is absolutely epic, but it's dominated by one of the most charismatic and complex figures in 20th century history, Sukarno. This guy wasn't just a political leader. He was an architect, a philosopher, a brilliant orator, and a master of political theater who turned Indonesian independence into a global cause. His famous speech declaring Indonesian independence on August 17, 1945, lasted only a few minutes, but it launched a 4-year war against Dutch attempts to re-establish colonial control. What makes the Indonesian Revolution so remarkable is how it combined traditional guerrilla warfare with modern diplomatic strategy. While Indonesian fighters were battling Dutch forces in the jungles of Java and Sumatra, Indonesian diplomats were working the newly formed United Nations, garnering support from anti-colonial movements around the world and building international pressure for Dutch withdrawal. The revolution succeeded not just because of military victories, but because Indonesian leaders understood that decolonization was part of a global transformation in the post-World War II international system. Sukarno's vision for independent Indonesia was breathtakingly ambitious. He didn't just want political independence, he wanted to create a new model for developing nations that would combine the best elements of socialism, nationalism, and traditional Indonesian values. His concept of guided democracy was an attempt to create a political system that would avoid the pitfalls of both Western capitalism and Soviet communism, while respecting Indonesia's cultural diversity and historical traditions. The Pancasila, Indonesia's founding philosophy developed by Sukarno, represents one of the most interesting attempts in modern history to create a national ideology that could unite an incredibly diverse population. The 5 principles: belief in one God, just and civilized humanity, Indonesian unity, democracy, and social justice, were designed to provide a framework that could accommodate Indonesia's hundreds of ethnic groups, multiple religions, and varying levels of economic development. But implementing this vision proved far more difficult than articulating it. The transition from colonial rule to independent nationhood created massive challenges that would test Indonesia's unity and democratic institutions. The country had to integrate hundreds of distinct ethnic and linguistic communities, manage an economy distorted by centuries of colonial extraction, and navigate the dangerous waters of Cold War geopolitics. The period from 1945 to 1965 was incredibly turbulent, marked by regional rebellions, economic instability, and increasing political polarization between communist, nationalist, and Islamic political movements. Sukarno's attempt to balance these competing forces through his guided democracy system ultimately collapsed, leading to one of the most tragic episodes in Indonesian history. The events of 1965-1966 represent a turning point that fundamentally changed Indonesia's trajectory. Following an alleged communist coup attempt, General Suharto seized power and launched a massive purge that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of suspected communists and their sympathizers. This period, known as the Indonesian mass killings, remains one of the least understood and most controversial chapters in Cold War history. Suharto's New Order regime, which lasted from 1966 to 1998, transformed Indonesia into an authoritarian, developmental state focused on economic growth and political stability. Unlike many other military dictatorships, Suharto's government achieved remarkable economic success, lifting millions of Indonesians out of poverty and transforming the country from an agricultural economy into a middle-income industrial nation. The New Order's development strategy was based on attracting foreign investment, exploiting Indonesia's vast natural resources, and gradually building manufacturing capacity. Indonesia became a major exporter of oil, natural gas, timber, and minerals, while also developing textile, electronics, and automotive industries. By the 1990s, Indonesia was being celebrated as one of the Asian tiger economies, with GDP growth rates that consistently exceeded 6% annually. But this economic success came at enormous political and social costs. The New Order regime systematically suppressed political opposition, controlled the media, and used military force to maintain stability. Regional autonomy movements were crushed, independent labor unions were banned, and civil society organizations were either co-opted or eliminated. The regime's approach to development also created massive environmental destruction and increased inequality between different regions and social groups. The Asian financial crisis of 1997-1998 exposed the fundamental weaknesses of Indonesia's authoritarian development model. Currency devaluation, bank failures, and massive unemployment created social unrest that the New Order regime could no longer control. Student protests, labor strikes, and ethnic violence ultimately forced Suharto to resign in May 1998, ending 32 years of authoritarian rule. The period since 1998, known as the Reform Era or Reformasi, has seen Indonesia undergo one of the most successful democratic transitions in modern history. The country has held regular competitive elections, established robust democratic institutions, and granted significant autonomy to regional governments. Press freedom has been restored. Civil society organizations have flourished, and Indonesia has become one of the most vibrant democracies in Southeast Asia. Modern Indonesia faces enormous challenges, but also tremendous opportunities. With a population of over 270 million people, Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous country and the largest economy in Southeast Asia. The country is incredibly diverse, with over 300 ethnic groups speaking more than 700 languages, making it one of the most culturally complex nations on Earth. Indonesia's strategic location between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, combined with its vast natural resources and growing middle class, positions it to become one of the world's major economic powers in the 21st century. The country is already the largest economy in ASEAN and plays an increasingly important role in regional and global affairs. The story of Indonesia, from ancient maritime empires to modern democratic nation, demonstrates the incredible resilience and adaptability of Indonesian society. Despite centuries of foreign domination, political upheaval, and economic challenges, Indonesians have maintained their cultural identity while successfully adapting to changing global circumstances. What makes Indonesian history so fascinating is how it challenges many of our assumptions about civilization, colonialism, and development. Indonesia shows us that sophisticated civilizations existed outside Europe long before the age of exploration, that colonialism was resisted in creative and effective ways, and that developing nations can find their own paths to modernization and democracy. The next time someone mentions Indonesia, remember that you're not just talking about another Southeast Asian country. You're talking about a civilization with one of the richest and most complex histories on Earth. From the Buddhist temples of Borobudur to the modern skyscrapers of Jakarta, from the spice traders of ancient Malacca to the tech entrepreneurs of modern Indonesia, this is a story that connects us to the deepest currents of human history and points towards some of the most exciting possibilities for our global future. This incredible journey through Indonesian history shows us that the most important stories aren't always the ones that make it into Western textbooks. Sometimes, the most fascinating chapters of human civilization are waiting to be discovered in places we least expect them.